Chapter 3, Always Be Cheerful. Keep no secrets. Ludovic de Beauvoir. In Japan, there are no secrets in daily life. Here, they do not understand what is shameful, or even what is not shameful. It is the innocence of heaven on earth. Ludovic de Beauvoir, nobleman, visited Japan from France in 1867. Received with an enthusiastic welcome, he toured Edo and was enthralled by the daily lives of the Japanese. One day in 1867, just before the Meiji Restoration, one friendly and cheerful French nobleman arrived in Japan with a prince. His name was Count Ludovic de Beauvoir. With the purpose of broadening his knowledge of the world, he had spent nearly a year traveling to Britain, Australia, the island of Java, Thailand, Hong Kong, Shanghai, and Beijing before finally arriving in Japan. Ludovic and the prince were welcomed by the national leaders in every country they visited. Japan also gave a fervent welcome to these noblemen from the French court. The welcome party came at the scheduled time, and the men journeyed for a month on Arabian horses, specially procured for them. They were accompanied everywhere by 10 samurai guards. It was VIP treatment in every sense. During this extensive trip, Ludovic wrote of the day's impressions every evening in his journal, and wrote the same in letters to his father as reports. He was a caring young man who wanted to convey the everyday scenes of his travels to his beloved father, who was ill in bed. In Ginza, he observed the mint. In Yokosuka, an iron mill. In Yokohama, he visited a licensed brothel. On the first day since landing in Yokohama, he wrote in his journal, "The women, let us start with them, are attractive." The fact that he writes his impression of women before anything else seems typical of a young Frenchman and shows Ludovic's honest and carefree charm. By this time, Ludovic had already spent 1 year traveling through various foreign countries, yet within days of arriving in Japan, he wrote, "I do not know of a people who are more sensitive to the beauties of nature than the Japanese." He also wrote, "The people are merry drinkers and are cheerful to the bottoms of their hearts." In the latter half of his trip, he seems to be enthralled in the lifestyles of the Japanese, writing, "I can say with certainty that these peaceful residents are enjoying a great bliss with their natural simplicity and their loyal dedication to their Lord." Saw the confusion during the last days of the Tokugawa shogunate and began to have a critical view of a Western-centric ideology. During his stay in Japan, Ludovic caught glimpses of the anti-shogunate movement during the Meiji Restoration. Following the end of his stay, he wrote the following letter to his father, a duke, while on a ship bound for San Francisco. "I hope this is simply my misunderstanding, but I frankly believe that Westerners brought the seeds of terrible conflict into this land, and the deep-rooted reform that is inciting all the classes of this nation is largely our fault." I want them to think about it, how approximately 30 years ago, Japan was under feudal law in which a national class system was one wholly ordinary state, and how, on its own, it lived, prospered, and was happy. Ludovic had experienced firsthand the abundant vigor and tranquil lifestyle of Japan, and as he left one of his last destinations of his round-the-world trip, he predicted that Japan, in one leap, would someday become a first-class country of the East. The Franco-Prussian War broke out in 1870, after Ludovic had returned to his home country. Although Ludovic also participated in battle at the helm of a flying column the French monarchy tragically crumbled. Paris was surrounded, and great confusion continued. The transformation in the last days of the Tokugawa shogunate is often called a violent upheaval, but compared to the atrocious war situation of his motherland, perhaps even this had looked peaceful to Ludovic's eyes. Enjoy everyday life. Charles Appleton Longfellow. I must say, the Japanese know how to enjoy themselves most rationally. Charles Appleton Longfellow, adventurer, visited Japan from the United States of America in 1871. Inherited his literary talent from his father, a great poet, and an enormous estate from his mother, who came from a wealthy merchant's family. Charles was born into the Longfellow family, where it was a tradition for each member to keep a diary. Those who traveled overseas sent back travel diaries, and the family would gather round to read them aloud. Charles also kept up this tradition. He wrote travel diaries at each destination he visited and sent them back to his family. Charles' connection to Japan was through a member of the expedition party of the Black Ships, led by the famous Commodore Perry. George Preble, Charles' uncle, was part of the party as a special correspondent for the newspaper. Charles, who was 9 years old at the time, presumably heard stories about the adventures in unknown lands from his uncle. No doubt he was excited. When he was 17, his mother, the daughter of a wealthy merchant, died from a fire, and Charles inherited a massive estate. With this inheritance, Charles set out on a trip around the world at a young age. He was a rare figure who led a very unusual life, never once taking up a productive job, but devoting his life to a career of adventures. After traveling all over the world, the adventurer found the ideal land in the Far East. Thanks to the fame of his father, who was a nationally acclaimed poet in the United States, Charles was able to have an audience with each of the nation's highest figures. When he went to Russia in 1866, he met with the Emperor of Russia in St. Petersburg. Afterwards, he traveled through Europe and Egypt and crossed the Red Sea into India. He spent over 1 year adventuring all over India and the Himalayas, and was welcomed at his various destinations by royal families. After that, he returned again to Europe via the brand new Suez Canal, which at that time had just opened 2 months ago. On his return trip from Europe to the United States, Charles participated in the adventure of a ship race. He steered the ship himself across the Atlantic Ocean, and his skill was enough to land them in second place. He was a bona fide globetrotter who crisscrossed freely across the world. In the following year, Charles headed to Japan. He was 27 years old. At the time, he only intended to stay for a few weeks. But he was deeply moved by the lifestyles of the Japanese people and the beautiful wildlife surrounded by the ocean. He extended his stay numerous times. Not satisfied with just staying at inns, Charles went as far as to purchase his own Japanese house. He favored a lifestyle that modeled that of a Japanese person, wearing Japanese clothes around the house and eating Japanese food. In the end, his original planned stay of a few weeks ended up being 1 year and 8 months. Charles, who was in the position of Deputy Secretary for the Kingdom of Hawaii, was even able to gain an audience with Emperor Meiji, which was nearly impossible for people in general, and even less so for foreigners. In this year of 1871, with no railway or automobiles, Charles turned to his wide social connections, his unsurpassed initiative to take action, and his inherent friendly manner that enabled him to be welcomed wherever he went. With these, he accomplished the impressive feat of traveling the length of Japan from Hokkaido all the way to Nagasaki. In one of the letters addressed to his family during his stay in Japan, Charles writes, "Japan is without exception the most beautiful country I have ever seen. There was a charm about Japan that entranced travelers, including even Charles, who had traveled all over the world. Exchanged pleasant greetings with one another. Gustav Kreitner. The people carrying loads on their shoulders were close to naked. They had bamboo supports resting on their shoulders and a very heavy transport basket on top. The bamboo columns looked like they were about to break from the weight. Yet despite undertaking such a difficult task, these people were always in the cheeriest of spirits and gave me pleasant greetings." Gustav Kreitner, military man, diplomat, visited Japan from Austria in 1878. Recognized for his skill as a surveyor, he was recruited to be part of a large-scale expedition to Japan. In the late 19th century, Japan was still an unknown land in Europe. Europeans were greatly eager to investigate this newly discovered country. Count Bela Széchenyi, a nobleman of Hungary, was no example. One day, the Count planned a large-scale expedition with Japan as one of its destinations. It was a trip that came with great risk. The Count, considering the possibility that he would not return safely, supposedly disposed of his collection of treasures before his departure. Treasures which were said to be of museum scale. It can be seen how much personal dedication the Count had towards this trip. Gustav Kreitner was one such member, recruited for the expedition. At the time, he had been assigned to work at a military geographical institute and was working diligently at his surveying job. Gustav had passed his lieutenant exams with flying colors, and his skill at surveying was recognized by his senior officers. This had led to his recommendation to be an accompanying member to Count Bela's Oriental expedition. In the typical manner of the geographer, Gustav strove to depict things without preconceptions, and kept a detailed record of what he saw and heard in the process of his journey. From Nagasaki, he reached the Seto Inland Sea, and by ship he traveled to and disembarked at Kobe. After exploring Osaka and Kyoto, he climbed Mount Fuji, then entered Tokyo. Language and cultural barriers were nothing for Gustav, who, with his staunch willpower, ventured alone to do a reconnaissance in Hokkaido. Experienced the boundless cheerfulness of the Japanese people, and was left with a strong impression of their difference from Europeans. Gustav arrived in Japan in the 19th century. At the time in Europe, there was widespread discontent amongst commoners due to a succession of wars and class conflicts. It was during this time that Gustav saw these jolly Japanese laborers on the other side of the globe on this island nation. It left an unforgettable impression on him, which can be seen very well in the following excerpt from his diary, where he observed women working in a factory making indigo dye. "Before exiting the factory building, we observed the women workers eating breakfast. About 100 women, in their everyday clothes, were sitting on chairs or desks eating. When we went inside, one of the women workers started laughing, and that laughter soon caught on to the girl next to her. Before long, the laughter spread to the rest of the people, and it went on so continuously that it shook the fragile wood foundations. The explosion of mirth came from the bottom of the heart, and I knew that it carried no hint of sarcasm. However, I still found myself very bewildered." The Japanese were cheerful and jolly, with an almost bottomless optimism. Gustav's direct encounter with the resounding laughter of these women was a memorable one. Gustav finished his trip and returned to his home, but later returned to Japan as a consul general. Perhaps his experience during this trip had influenced him to some extent. Always smile as a form of etiquette. Edmund Kato. Smiling is a form of etiquette to the Japanese. Every person encountered on the road is pleasant and never fails to smile. Edmund Kato, journalist, visited Japan from France in 1881. Was sent on a work assignment to research Japan and was deeply moved by the cheerfulness of the people. Edmund Kato worked as a journalist before becoming a traveler, and one could say that he was one of the first dedicated travelogue authors. In 1881, Edmond was commissioned by the French Ministry of National Education to research China and Siberia. He stopped by in Japan on his way back. After crossing the Russian continent, he departed Vladivostok on a Danish ship and landed in Nagasaki. From Nagasaki, he traveled on water through the Seto Inland Sea to Yokohama and Tokyo. Edmund arrived in Nagasaki in mid-August during the Obon festival and was deeply moved at how cheerful everyone was. During his explorations, Edmond happened upon a crowd of people gathered around a tea stall set up in the middle of a cemetery. Families were sitting in circles in front of gravestones eating meals or snacks. People going to and fro exchanged greetings over the graves. The adults lit pipes and drank tea and sake, and the children ran about in excitement. It was a cemetery in broad daylight, but the sound of firecrackers and fireworks rang out. When night fell, the owner of the graveyard appeared with lanterns to light the surroundings. Despite the great crowd of people, there were no signs of pushing or shoving or of any conflict. No one seemed in a rush on the narrow paths, and everyone stepped aside to let the explorer through. Smiles could be seen on the people's faces wherever one went. This was the first sight of Japanese people that Edmond had caught immediately after his arrival, and it left a strong impression on him. Recorded his emotionally moving impressions of Japan with sophisticated technique. Edmond wrote that the scenes on the streets of Japan were like a dream world. After sunset, the houses on both sides of the street would open their front gates wide, and the light from countless colorful lanterns would shine on the houses. This dreamlike scene looked so unlike anything Edmond was used to seeing in Western civilization that he felt a strange sense of euphoria. He wrote, "This is almost like a world of fairies and dreams." Edmond later traveled south on the Tokaido by rickshaw. He wrote in vivid detail the various things he saw and heard during his journey. How the hairstyles of the women in Tokyo differed from those in Kyoto. About the tough but friendly rickshaw drivers. And how the girls at the tea houses would kindly help Edmond and his company take off their shoes. Edmond also wrote about how the Japanese appeared unconcerned, despite being faced with a bridge that had washed away from a typhoon, and about his surprise at seeing Westerners getting irritated over it. Edmond spent over 2 months from summer to fall touring various spots in Japan. As a writer for a world travel magazine, Edmond was renowned for his skill at discovering charming aspects about each land and depicting them accurately. At each country he visited, he was quick to accurately capture the country's unique personality. He compared Kyoto's Kamo River to the Sena, and the ancient city of Athens to Kyoto. It was a sophisticated technique that only he could wield as a professional traveler who had experienced a wealth of things abroad. One could say that Edmond's travelogues are trustworthy records that set themselves apart from countless recollections by lay individuals, which often tend to be biased by the writer's subjective views. Always be cheerful. Sherard Osborne. Everybody looks well washed, contented, and merry. You do not meet a single cross or sullen look. Sherard Osborne, military man, visited Japan from Britain in 1858. Strove to keep a cool-headed record as a voyager. Highly interested in Japan, he went around collecting ukiyo-e paintings. Sherard's career as a Navy officer regularly required him to take expeditions all over the world. He visited Japan during a tumultuous time between Bakumatsu and Meiji eras as a member of a party visiting to conclude a commercial treaty between England and Japan. Part of Sherard's duty as a voyager was to observe Japan in a consistently dispassionate manner and leave records of his observations. At the time, such information brought back to England by voyagers like him were extremely prized as materials for politicians and nobles to become aware of the outside world and to learn the existence of people who had different cultural backgrounds from them. Sherard has written a number of books about Japan. During his writing process, Sherard appears to have perused various kinds of literature about Japan, written by his predecessors. These included Siebold, Marco Polo, Francis Xavier, and William Adams. Through these materials, Sherard acquired knowledge about the ways in which Japan and Europe had traded and had diplomatic relations in the past. From Sherard's records, one can see that he had a very strong interest in Japan. He made an effort to write about aspects, such as Japanese society, lifestyle, and personalities as well, which was uncommon for voyage records at the time. It is also said that during his stay in Edo, despite his presumably busy schedule in his mission of concluding the treaty, Sherard found the time to buy ukiyo-e paintings and shop for various other articles. Felt joy at the welcoming attitudes of the Japanese, and also showed surprise at their cheerful manner. Upon arrival in Japan, Sherard was moved by the beautiful scenery of the waters of Nagasaki, and showed surprise at the liveliness of the people who had gathered to watch. From his writings, one could see that Japanese people at the time did not reject the sudden arrival of foreigners. In fact, their faces showed eager interest and even joy at being able to see something rare. Sherard writes, "The most striking thing in this city was that every man, woman, and child looked happy and contented." Sherard arrived in Japan a few years after a giant earthquake had occurred in the Shimoda region. Sherard, who had been informed of the immense damage that resulted from it, wrote in his records that he could not hide his surprise at the sight before him. Despite the fact that it had only been a few years since the town suffered destruction by a great tsunami, the residents of the reconstructed town all looked happy and liberated. Sherard had gazed at these carefree people, and the deep impression compelled him to append the remark. When leaving Japan, Sherard reflected upon his stay as a joyful experience, writing, "Our pleasant task draws to a close." It seems that his visit to Edo also left a strong impression on him. He wrote, "Our stay there had been a bright oasis in the desert-like monotony of our existence in China," and wished from the bottom of his heart to visit again.